Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be with you at this last session of TRT World Forum. I hope we'll make it as exciting as possible. I mean, obviously it's up to the panel to do that, but let me set the stage. The title reminds me a quote from Antonio Gramsci, who, while in prison, said that the old world is dying, the new world is struggling to be born. Now it is a time of monsters. Well, the rule-based world order is under stress, if we put it mildly. In fact, there are big cracks appearing. So at my keynote presentation, I'll have a few slides in a moment. I'd like to cover structural global challenges and Turkey's response to this in terms of building resilience. So I'll go straight to the challenges. Well, first of all, trade fragmentation is no longer a theoretical risk. It's a reality. Protectionism is now the new normal. High global indebtedness at a time when long-term interest rates are high is a real risk, both in terms of as a speed limit to growth, but in terms of putting more nations or more people in a relatively distressed situation in terms of debt servicing. Aging world population is another structural headwind for global growth. Rising geopolitical tensions, conflicts. We've got plenty of hotspots. There are also transformative, but also equally potentially disruptive frontier technologies, such as AI. And finally, of course, climate crisis. So let me cover these topics and tell you what we're doing in terms of preparedness and building resilience. Trade fragmentation. The root cause of trade fragmentation is to do with geostrategic competition between United States, which is considered to be the hegemon power, and, of course, the emerging superpower, which is China. And as you can see, if you look at trade restrictions, for the past 2 years, you can see a lot of concentration in both the United States and China in terms of restrictive trade interventions. The number of protectionist measures, these are new measures, not cumulative. We had very few measures in the run-up to or before global financial crisis. Post-global financial crisis, protectionism has picked up. But in recent years, it's really gone through the roof. So it's up, relative to a decade or a decade and a half ago by 9 folds. These are the number of new trade protectionist measures. This is dramatic. If the current trend is sustained, it could actually reduce global GDP by as much as Germany and French economy combined. So we're talking about big numbers here. Friendshoring is a new trend on the back of this geostrategic competition between the United States and China. This is going to be increasingly more so going forward. So what does really, all these means for us, and what are we going to do about it? Well, Trump 2.0, version 2 of Trump, I think the risk is that there'll be more tariffs, not only against China, but also against other countries. That's what pre-election rhetoric, essentially suggest. If that is the case, it actually might mean higher inflation in the USA, but also higher, longer-term interest rates in the USA. This is bad news for emerging markets, for developing markets, for everyone. But there's also risk that will come indirectly from this policy because China has massive capacity in almost every single manufacturing sector. And if China is faced with tariffs, it's highly unlikely that they would destroy the capacity. Instead, they will reroute their exports. And that means, indirectly, our markets are at huge risk. Plus, of course, that will also mean slower Chinese growth and slower global growth. So there you go. Slower growth means lower risk appetite for emerging markets. Higher US inflation, higher US yields means higher cost of funding globally. This cannot be good news. I've just covered this. The rerouting scenario is largely to do with the fact that China is global manufacturing base, accounting for over 30%. Well, so how does Turkey respond? Well, first of all, we're likely to be resilient to the current climate, the protectionist climate. Why? Because we have 54 free trade agreements, including, of course, a customs union with European Union. And it covers 62% of our exports. And we are in the process of we are currently negotiating comprehensive FTAs, free trade agreements, with GCC countries, with many other countries, Central Asia. So hopefully, over the next few years, about 3/4, of our exports will be covered by rule-based free trade agreements. If that's the case, it's highly likely that Turkey will be a lot more resilient than other relative open economies. So that's my first conclusion. Because, in fact, you could make an argument that Turkey could benefit from nearshoring and possibly friendshoring. Why? Because we're friends with Central Asia, we're friends with Middle East, we're friends with Balkans as well as EU because we have a customs union with EU, and of course we're friends also with North Africa, Africa in general. So we're close and we're friends. So technically speaking, we could be benefiting from friendshoring and nearshoring. We're also strongly focused on enhancing regional trade integration and connectivity. The new development road that would extend rail and road connectivity all the way from, basically Basra, all the way to London, all the way to China. So clearly, we also have a project that will help deepen and broaden regional ties. That is, by the way, the best way, the best fix against global protectionist measures. Global indebtedness. Global debt has been rising. Global debt to GDP ratio is currently over 300%. And 3.3 billion people live in countries where debt service, meaning interest payments on their debt, is more than what those countries are spending on education or healthcare. This is pretty dramatic. And higher interest rates in the US on the back of higher fiscal deficits in the US or higher inflation, unfortunately, will make this picture much worse. Luckily, Turkey's overall indebtedness, and that includes private sector debt as well as public sector debt, corporate debt, household debt, Turkey's debt to GDP ratio is 99%, including all forms of debt, while emerging market average is 245%. And advanced economies is 377%. So we're not highly leveraged economy. While obviously higher rates will have an impact, but we'll be a lot more resilient. And this is all about building resilience. That's why fiscal discipline has been a key characteristics of the ruling party governments. Under President Erdogan, fiscal discipline has been one of the defining features of our government. A debt to GDP on a government level, debt to GDP ratio is only 26%, well below Maastricht criteria. So essentially, we're likely to be highly resilient again to these type of shocks. Aging world population. The world is aging. Why? Well, fertility rates have collapsed. That's the chart that tells you. So basically, if you go back to 60s, fertility rate was over 5%. 30 years later, it's down to 3%. Now it's heading to almost sub 2%. Not yet, but it's heading that way. And that's why, the share of what we call old aged population, meaning 65 plus years old as a percent of population used to, about 70 years ago was 5%. It has already doubled. But it's going to go up by another 5 percentage points in a much shorter period of time. So aging populations are also a drag for global growth, but also it would have significant fiscal implications. Luckily, Türkiye, relative to its peers, it still has a strong growth in working age population. But more importantly, Türkiye has a massive untapped demographic potential, because female labor participation rate is 36%, and we are going to boost that. And if we were to reach OECD average, that would still give us plenty of untapped potential. So again, while aging population is a speed limit for many countries, we're in relatively, again, good shape. Rising geopolitical tensions and conflicts. If you look at this map, this highlights global hotspots in terms of conflicts. I mean, as you can see, it's pretty widespread. And geopolitical risks have been high. Markets are ignoring it, but have been high. In times like this, during the times of monsters, you have to be strong. And that's why we invested heavily in our own defense industry. Over 80% of our defense industry equipments are localized. This used to be exactly the opposite. 20 years ago, we were importing 20%. So we've got over 1,000 defense industry projects, and we've become a major player in global defense industry. Last year, we were number 11th largest exporter in the world of defense industry equipments. So bottom line is, conflicts are not desirable, but all the countries have to be prepared. And Turkey, in that sense, again, is highly likely to have the needed deterrence and the needed resilience in that sense. But it's not just the hard power. It is the soft power that matters too. And if you look at our diplomatic footprint, as you can see, we are emerging as one of global soft power centers. Transformative, disruptive frontier technologies. Transformation means higher productivity. That's good news. But disruption is not necessarily a good news. So again, preparedness is the key. If you look at generative AI or the rise of robots, there is immense potential in terms of productivity growth. Of course, there are concerns about job losses. But I would be more concerned about higher income inequalities or concentration of wealth through big tech. This is an important area. And greater, of course, geographic disparities, because not all countries have AI preparedness. So when we look at AI preparedness, Turkey ranks, obviously, we're not as good as advanced economies, but we're ahead of emerging market average. So when you look at Turkey's digital infrastructure, innovation, integration, human capital, policies, Turkey is not in a bad shape. But obviously, we have to continue to invest. And that's why we've prioritized, hyperscaler data centers, but also, continued investment in fiber optics infrastructure, in human capital, so across the board. So AI preparedness is something that is one of the key components of our future policy framework. When you look at innovation, again, when you compare Turkey with her peers, we're not in bad shape either. If you look at what we call upper middle income countries, China is the most innovative, Malaysia is second, Turkey is number 3. So yes, relative to high income countries, we're not where we would like to be. But within our own league, we're the 3rd most innovative country. So in that sense, again, there is resilience, there is preparedness. Impending climate disaster. Look, global warming is now real. I think everybody almost agree. Last year was the hottest year ever. And every year seems to be like that. So it's real. And we don't seem to be doing much about it, unfortunately. The business as usual scenario, which is the current scenario, unless we ramp up and do something about it, the risk of a 3.2% centigrade increase in global average temperature is real. That risk is not negligible. And if that risk were to materialize, there cannot be good news for humanity. It cannot be good news for people. Because it would imply 18% loss in global GDP relative to the base case scenario. It would imply a 20% increase in global hunger. It will imply many more deaths, 14.5 million additional deaths. This is really something we cannot afford. And that's why everyone has to do something about it. When we look at Turkey's disaster risk map, from obviously earthquake fault lines to floods and forest fires and avalanches and landslides, so all the risks in one map, we're not immune. And that's why we need to be prepared. What are we doing? Well, first of all, we're speeding up the green transition. This is one of our top priorities, along with digital transformation. So the twin transformation. The share of renewables in our generation, electricity power generation, has gone up from 25% to 42% relative to 25 years ago. This is not a poor performance for your information. 42% is a pretty good number. The share in installed capacity is 59%. This is also a pretty decent number. So 59%. So we're doing well, but we're not going to stop here. We're going to continue to focus on this. Secondly, water, is going to be a scarce commodity. Everybody seems to think there's plenty of water, but we have to manage it well. I don't really have time because I was told that, I have 15, 20 minutes, but we're doing a lot. Over the past, couple of decades, we've invested almost $100 billion in specifically these areas. And this is all about sustainable agriculture. This is all about sustainability. Of course, we're also building resilient cities through urban renewal. Social housing, resilient social housing, is one of our key priorities. The mass housing agency, TOKI, has built 1.3 million units. And if you look at earthquake reconstruction, we are delivering, hopefully by the end of this year, about 200,000 units, housing units, flats, with another 250,000+ in the following year or two. So as you can see, this is pretty large urban renewal, resilient cities building efforts. Okay, I've highlighted many global challenges and tried to give you some color on what we're doing. My final bit of this presentation is about global growth. As you can see, there are plenty of headwinds, and the world doesn't seem to be doing enough to basically weather these shocks. So what can the world do? What should the world do, actually, to stem the decline in global growth? Because global growth is much slower than what it was a couple of decades ago. Well, I mean, look at this simple chart. 5-year ahead global growth projections. At any point, it used to be about 4 to 5% comfortably. And now it's down to about 3%. This is 5-year growth projections at any point. These are by the IMF, World Economic Outlook. So how can we stop this slowdown? Well, there are no easy fixes, but there is a good menu here. The menu is this. Essentially, what drags growth down is fragmentation and public debt overhang. There are many other factors, but those are the two top. What could boost growth is productivity through new technologies, including AI, but also structural reforms. Structural reforms are nice to talk about, hard to deliver. Well, I can only speak on behalf of Türkiye. Last year, I told you about our medium-term economic program, the macroeconomic stabilization and reform program. This year, as you can see, I didn't tell you about the narrowing current account deficit, declining inflation, rebuilding reserves, improving fiscal position. As you can see, I didn't tell you much about, because I wanted to deliver on what the theme was. But I can tell you this, we have a pretty comprehensive structural reform agenda. And we are going to push these reforms through. In fact, we are taking steps. It's a continuous effort. And the whole aim is to boost productivity, enhance competitiveness, because that's how you can create sustained prosperity. But that's not enough. We're also going to continue to take measures to reduce income inequalities, to improve income distribution. So clearly, structural reforms is another key agenda item. I'm not sure if I stick to the time, but I hope you enjoyed my setting the scene, presentation. I think if the world, if humanity were to wake up to these challenges and start collaborating, then maybe we have a good chance of addressing these challenges without sacrificing growth. If we are unable to talk to each other and get our act together and cooperate and, basically go back to a new rule-based, fair, global system. Today's system is not fair. Then I think we could address all of this. Thank you very much. Enjoy.